back to the Compliance Kitchen. This is Sylvia, and today let's take a look at a recent OFAC settlement. They issued a press release on August 27. This is a settlement between OFAC and First Bank SA, located in Romania, and its U.S. parent company, J.C. Flowers and Company. It is in regards to First Bank's processing of transactions in apparent violations of OFAC's Iran and Syria sanctions programs. The settlement was in the amount of $862,318, and the release tells us that First Bank processed 98 commercial transactions that totaled something over $3.5 million through U.S. banks on behalf of parties that were located in Iran and Syria. J.C. Flowers acquired a majority ownership interest in First Bank, so that's how they're connected to this. And after the acquisition, it is said that First Bank processed euro-denominated payments for persons in Iran. Now, looking at the web notice in more detail, OFAC tells us that in early 2019, First Bank's regulator, the National Bank of Romania, flagged a US dollar transaction that First Bank had processed for a shipment of timber from Romania to Syria. As a result, First Bank commenced a 5-year look back, the results of which First Bank and J.C. Flowers reported voluntarily self-disclosed to OFAC. The apparent violations related to 3 categories of payments. So one was processing US dollar payments for individuals or entities in Iran. The transactions constituted an indirect exportation of financial services to Iran and caused U.S. financial institutions to export financial services to Iran, which is in violation of the U.S.-Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations. This was because First Bank processed outgoing payments through U.S. banks in which the end user was in Iran, and the payments were made on behalf of Iranian customers of First Bank. So that was the first category of the apparent violations. The second was processing US dollar payments for individuals or entities in Syria. So here, OFAC tells us that First Bank processed 36 payments through US banks, where the finance documentation showed that the importers were located in Syria. Again, these transactions constituted an indirect exportation of financial services to Syria and caused U.S. financial institutions to export financial services to Syria, which is in violation of the Syrian sanctions regulations. And the third category was processing euro-denominated payments to Iran as a foreign subsidiary of a U.S. company. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, J.C. Flowers acquired a majority interest in First Bank in June of 2018, which made First Bank an entity that was majority owned by a U.S. person and thus subject to the prohibitions in the Iranian transactions sanctions regulations. And subsequent to this, First Bank processed euro-denominated payments outside the U.S. financial system involving Iranian parties and interests where there was no applicable exemption or authorization for these transactions. They did this with actual knowledge or reason to know that the payments were destined for Iranian parties. And so, of course, these were in violation of the Iranian transactions sanctions regulations. Further, OFAC tells us that the apparent violations resulted from First Bank's lack of understanding of the scope of U.S. sanctions regulations that are applicable to financial institutions that don't necessarily have physical presence in the U.S. And in particular, the bank's training and procedures for monitoring potential sanctions-related activity did not address the risk that First Bank could be indirectly exporting financial services through the U.S. financial system to sanctioned parties or sanctioned jurisdictions, or processing transactions that did not transit the United States but were processed while majority owned by a U.S. person. So again, the company self-disclosed these violations. OFAC determined that they were non-egregious, and so the penalties were assessed accordingly. Again, if you guys want to take a closer look at the aggravating and also mitigating factors, I have a link to the enforcement release and the press release on compliancekitchen.com.